everyone. I'm so glad to be back with you. It's been a while. I now am ready to do the next 7 lessons on complex trauma. So this is lesson 3. If you have not watched lesson 1 and 2, please go back and do that before you go into this lesson, because you're going to need that background to help you. So let's get started on complex trauma. So complex traumatic stress disorder. There is no cohesive trauma literature in complex trauma literature. There's PTSD literature, but there's no cohesive literature that really addresses the issue of complex trauma. So the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is like the, we call it the psychological Bible, has diagnostic categories that have criteria for specifying a trauma history with PTSD or acute stress disorder, which is under a 30-day timeline. You can't be diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, unless you have had the symptoms for at least 30 days. So neither diagnosis, though, has the criteria that encompasses all of the additional symptoms that are discussed in child abuse literature. So that's what we're going to look at. Now we're moving forward from the ATS, the acute traumatic stress disorder, and then PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, to complex traumatic stress disorder. So while the symptoms, all the symptoms for CTSD, complex traumatic stress disorder, include those found in PTSD, sorry about all these acronyms, you'll get used to them, post-traumatic stress disorder, it also includes the following. So for someone with complex traumatic stress disorder or CTSD, they have a distorted view of themselves. They have low self-esteem and self-hatred. They blame themselves for abuse, and they have high degrees of guilt and shame. They have altered or impaired identity formation. They have impaired identity confusion. So they're very confused about who they are and how they might, their own identity as a person. They have severely impaired trust issues that interfere with all kinds of healthy development of relationships. So you need to look for those things. In fact, you won't have to look for them. Once you begin to talk to someone, it's pretty easy to identify these things. So here's some other symptoms. Let me just grab a drink for a second. These are symptoms as well of complex traumatic stress. These individuals have difficulties with affect or emotional regulation. And in fact, the very last series in this teaching is going to be a whole lesson on emotional regulation. So also dissociation. So that's a disconnection or a separation of the mind, the will, and the emotion from the physical body. It's like there is a total disconnect. What is going on mentally, what's going on in the will and your emotions from what is going on in the reality in the body. So in extreme cases, there can actually be a disconnect between the spirit and the soul. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. There's other symptoms, the self-perception, which I mentioned, and the perception of the perpetrator. Often there's a real confusion, and there is almost sometimes an alignment between the individual and the perpetrator. They have also difficulty with relationships and understanding relationships and seeing hazard signs in some relationships. So they get into very bad situations. So for instance, a woman who has been very chronically abused in childhood will sometimes end up in prostitution. In fact, often in prostitution. And being, it's almost like a repetition of the abuse that she suffered in childhood. And then they have struggles with systems of meaning. So let's continue. We're going to look now at some of the intrusive things that happen when there's a trauma, that a severe traumatic experience. Then you have intrusive memories. They just pop up out of nowhere. Some people have a very high startle response, as a hypervigilance response, panic attack. So that's when all of a sudden the individual just can't breathe. It feels like they're having a heart attack, but it really isn't. It's a panic attack. Emotionally overwhelmed. Many people who have complex traumatic stress disorder have chronic pain, continual migraines and headaches, eating disorders. They have substance abuse, addictions, self-destructive behaviors, little or no memories for parts or most of their childhood, hypervigilance that I talked about, dissociative identity and dissociation, which I mentioned before. Also, what is that? Depression is very high in this population. Irritability. So these people often are irritable for no reason at all, it seems. Loss of interest in life. You'll see that this comes and goes, but often it comes along with numbing. So there's this sense where they feel so numb, they just can't function. Insomnia. So a sleeplessness that goes back to the nightmares, the flashbacks. The minute they close their eyes, it's like all of a sudden everything is coming back a 40-fold, and they're really struggling. A decreased concentration. You will find this in children who have been abused, severely abused, chronically abused, that they have a hard time focusing on studies. And then, of course, for adults, it continues throughout your life until you address the issues. Hopelessness, depression, all of those things. So those are some other symptoms. You know, the prerequisite condition, though, for CTSD is the experience of being totally controlled over a period of months or years. So that's why early childhood trauma, poor situations for children, chronic sexual abuse, chronic physical abuse, this whole sense of being controlled, you'll find that that's what if you mention it to them, that's all of a sudden they resonate with that sense of absolute control over a period of their childhood or their life. Then those who have or who are likely to experience complex traumatic stress disorder are hostages, people who have been held hostage, prisoners of war perhaps, concentration camp survivors, survivors of religious cults, and also those who are victims of continual intimate partner abuse. So you can see that this actually applies to a lot of people. And you yourself may be able to identify with some of these symptoms. That doesn't necessarily mean that you may, have CTSD, but it points in that direction. Certainly if you have a whole series of these symptoms, that's highly likely. So let's compare the literature between post-traumatic stress disorder and complex traumatic stress disorder. So literature is based on war-related trauma, basically, with PTSD. It's isolated traumatic events. The trauma source is usually not from an intimate relationship. That makes a big difference because we're talking about attachment and parental attachment and attachments in childhood, which makes a difference in the psyche. The examples used in PTSD are war-related. Natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, single rape of an adult, that would create PTSD, not necessarily CTSD, and physical injury. So those are just some of the things. Also witnessing a serious event, maybe a war tragedy, or perhaps a very serious car accident, and seeing someone that has been very seriously injured, that can create symptoms of PTSD. But they're relatively short-lived and can be treated pretty successfully with short-term therapy. But then with CTSD, the literature is informed primarily from childhood sexual abuse. And there are always multiple traumatic events, chronic trauma that has happened in the child's youth, very young, usually sometimes much before 5, from infancy onward, but certainly chronic abuse before the age of 12 really predisposes a child to CTSD. The trauma source will also include intimate relationships. That means it could have been, the child could have been raped repeatedly by a father, a stepfather, an uncle, a grandfather, someone that was close to the child that should have been able to be trusted. And so that dynamic interferes with the child's development, all sorts of development. So the examples, of course, are childhood sexual abuse and or extreme neglect, physical, sexual, emotional, spiritual, or a combination, and watching or being part of domestic abuse. So those are what we normally have to compare with PTSD and CTSD. Let me just grab another drink. I'm really dry today. Thank you. It is winter here in Ontario, and that means that inside in the homes, it gets very dry. Okay, so let's look at the criteria for diagnosing PTSD, post-traumatic stress. So first of all, a history of exposure to an event, traumatic event, that meets 2 criteria and symptoms from at least 3 of these symptom clusters. So intrusive recollection, so memories that come into the mind intrusively, they just pop up. All of a sudden they're there, and the person it's like the person is shocked by the memory being there. Avoidant or numbing symptoms, so the person wants to shut down. Hyperarousal symptoms, so this is this intense fear and living in a place of anxiety, constant anxiety. And then the criteria also concerns the duration of the symptoms. How long does this last? And then, of course, access functioning. So there's several things here. So criterion A, the person has been exposed to a traumatic event in which both of the following have been present. The person has experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with the event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury or threat to the physical integrity of the person. Or alternately, the person's response includes intense fear, hopelessness, terror, horror. Note, in children, that can be expressed a little differently. So instead, they look like they are disorganized or confused or agitated. That's kind of the behavior you will see, and you may be shocked and think, well, what is that about? And, you know, if you begin to see some of the other criteria, you can put this together pretty quickly and begin to think, this child's maybe suffered some kind of traumatic event that no one knows about. And often that's the case. And children, especially when it is from an intimate relationship, if the child has been abused by a parent or someone close to the child, you may not be told because children are loyal. And not only that, many children have been threatened with death by the perpetrator or death of another loved one. For instance, a father says to the child that if you ever tell anyone, I'll kill your mother. Well, you can bet that that child is not going to be very quick to tell anyone. Even if you question them, they are most likely to deny it because they feel that their actions and behavior will control what happens to other people. And that is really, really a hard one to get over. So you have to develop a trust relationship before you can expect to have someone talked about what has been happening to them. So let's look at criteria B. So this is about intrusive recollections or memories that all of a sudden flood the mind. So the traumatic event is persistently re-experienced. So it's like right in living technicolor, the child is seeing it again, or the adult, because this child can put up all kinds of walls and in their mind and grow into an adult, never having dealt with the traumatic event, and then all of a sudden it surfaces, most often when the individual's in their mid-30s to 50s, in those years. And so they begin to re-experience the events because it only sits dormant in the mind for so long. And then it's like when that individual starts feeling safe or is in a safe relationship, all of a sudden things start coming to the surface, memories that they will quickly try and suppress and deny. So they're re-experienced in some of these ways, recurrent and intrusive, distressing recollections and memories, very distressing of the event. So it's like they have a snapshot, they're looking, and they see it like a recording in their mind, like a video in their mind, and it's very distressing. They want to shut it off, they want to shut it down, they want to escape, of course. So that includes images. All of a sudden they'll see an image, or perceptions, thoughts. Sometimes it's a smell that triggers this recollection. A smell currently that really triggers something from a smell in their childhood. And then recurrent dreams of the event. And that's, it's very hard. That's where the insomnia comes and the fear of going to sleep, because of course, if they sleep, then these memories will come back. Again, acting or feeling as if the traumatic event were reoccurring in the here and now. It's happening again. It's like they are experiencing it right now. So if you can get a picture of what that might be like, it's like it's happening. It's not something they're remembering from the past. It's like for them, it's happening right now. And they're seeing it and they're totally involved in that recollection, that memory. Sometimes you go like this and it's like they're detached. So intense psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues. So that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. So say it's a hostage or a prisoner of war who is free now, and they see something. They're walking past perhaps a place where there's a chain link fence, and all of a sudden it's like the memories are right there, the recollection is right there. And so those cues symbolize something. They symbolize them being in a place where they had no control and that they were abused. Something like that. It can be all kinds of things. There's physiologic reactivity, so their body reacts to the exposure and the external cues, and that are symbolizing this an aspect of the traumatic event. So let me give you an example. I'm just thinking that perhaps it's a child who okay, so it could be a child who was sexually abused, and every time that the abuser raped them, he played a particular song on the radio or something like that, and that song then is embedded in the psyche, the memory, the unconscious psyche of that individual now as an adult. So when they hear that song, their body reacts. They may curl up, they may get probably very small. That's often how they respond to those external cues. You may find that they're hiding in a closet, and you have no explanation for that, and they don't even know how they got there. It just happens so fast, and they're not really aware of the current reality. So then there's this criteria C, which is avoidant and numbing. So this is a persistent avoidance of any kind of stimuli that's associated with the traumatic event. So maybe any kind of music, a particular kind of music that they just want to stay right away from, or any kind. They may walk around where the chain link fence is. They would walk a whole block or lots further than that to escape, to avoid going past that chain link fence. So it's a numbing of general responsiveness, and it's indicated by some of these symptoms. So there's an effort to avoid thoughts about the trauma or feelings or conversations, anything associated with the event. And then they often avoid activities or people and places where the recollections might surface, where they're more likely to come to mind. So maybe it's in a mall, or maybe it's in some out of the way place. They will, anything that would trigger that memory. And then an inability often to recall important aspects of the trauma. It's like they can see the whole thing, but there may be one piece that they're missing, and it could be they just feel like there's something that they just don't understand. And that's part of the process of the therapeutic work, is to help them uncover that and to reconcile it. And we'll talk more about that in other lessons. So again, with the avoidant and numbing, there's a diminished interest, a big diminishment of interest or participation in significant activities that perhaps in the past they loved to do. So when a child refuses to go to the playground, or refuses to go to their cousin's house that they love to go to, those kind of things. And for an adult who is now just starting to deal with the memories, they will do the same kind of thing. They will avoid certain kinds of places and activities. The feeling of detachment, they may feel detached from reality, and have a kind of an estrangement from others. It's like they can't connect to other people. And a restricted level or range of affect. So that's emotional. They just have restricted emotions. It may look or seem like they are just very, detached comes to mind again, but there's a restriction. It's like they cannot really express their emotions. And many of them have a sense of a foreshortened future. They really, really feel that they're going to die very young. They won't live a very long life. And that actually, and it's so sad, it is played out in many lives. So it's something that definitely needs to be looked at and helped with. And then criteria D is hyperarousal. What is that? Well, it's persistent symptoms of increasing arousal, anxiety that was not present before the trauma. So, and it's indicated by a couple things: difficulty falling or staying asleep, outbursts, angry outbursts, irritability, and really without cause, and hypervigilance, which I talked about before, and startled response. All of a sudden, somebody comes up behind them and they're just, and I do this, so I know what it's like. All of a sudden, you're just going to go, ah! Anyways, so many people have that. And then the last two criteria, E and F, talk about the duration of the disturbance. So you have to have symptoms in the other categories, but they all have to last more than 1 month, and they have to incorporate functional significance. So that means that something about how the person deals with life is not up to par. It's like they just, maybe it's hygiene, you know, they just stop taking a shower, or they just don't take care of themselves, or something functionally that they are no longer able to do. So the disturbance also must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social functioning, occupational, so at work they're no longer able to do their job, or other significant areas of functioning. So you will see that kind of thing happen with someone who has severe complex trauma, and all complex trauma is severe. So that's it for today, and I'll be back with lesson 3, and I hope that you are able to watch this and then rewatch it, because I know it's a lot of information. Have a great day. Thanks for listening.